The bell was small, no larger than a man's fist, cast from old brass that had seen better days. It hung from a leather cord on the second-story window of a grand house on Maple Street in the silver town of Blackwood, Wyoming Territory. On most nights, it stayed silent. But on the night the storm came down from the Wind River Mountains in December of 1879, that small brass bell rang once. Just once. A sound so faint it could barely be heard above the howling wind. But high on the mountain 20 miles to the east, 3 men were watching, and they had been waiting for that sound for 12 long years. This is the story those old men still tell around fires in the high country. The story of a Charleston girl who came west to marry a devil dressed in a gentleman's vest, and the 3 triplet brothers who came down the mountain through a blizzard to do what an entire town had been too afraid to do for 3 winters running. They say the bell still hangs in that window today, rusted and silent, but no one in Wyoming has ever dared to take it down. Some things the old-timers say ought to be left alone. Some bells should not be rung twice. In the autumn of 1878, in the city of Charleston, South Carolina, a young woman named Hannah May Bellwether knelt beside a fresh grave in the cemetery behind First Baptist Church. The headstone was simple: Reverend Josiah Bellwether, 1827 to 1878. Beloved servant of the Lord. The yellow fever had taken him in 3 days. It had taken half the congregation in 2 months. Hannah had nursed her father until the very end, holding cool cloths to his fevered brow, reading the 23rd Psalm aloud, while his breathing grew shallower and his fingers grew cold. She was 22 years old, and she was alone in the world. Hannah was a soft and pretty creature, full-figured in the way Renaissance painters loved, with honey blonde hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders and large cornflower blue eyes that seemed too big for her round face. Her skin had the warmth of fresh peaches, and when she blushed, which she did often, her cheeks bloomed pink. She had been raised in the Lord's house, taught to read scripture by the time she was 4, taught to play hymns on the parlor piano by the time she was 7. She knew how to bake cornbread and mend a torn collar and pray for the sick. She did not know how to survive in the world without her father. Her mother had died bringing her into it, a woman named Sarah Calloway Bellwether, who had come from somewhere in the high country, somewhere her father refused to speak of. Hannah had never asked twice. There were certain doors in the Bellwether house that stayed closed, and the door to her mother's past was the heaviest of them all. All she had of her mother was a small gold cross on a thin chain and a tintype photograph kept in a Bible drawer showing a tall blonde woman with kind eyes standing beside a man Hannah did not recognize. Now, Hannah had nothing else. The parsonage belonged to the church, and the new minister would be arriving in 3 weeks. The deacons had been kind, but kindness does not pay rent. Her aunt, an elderly spinster named Prudence Bellwether, lived in a tiny cottage near the harbor and could barely feed herself, much less a niece who had never learned a trade. It was Aunt Prudence who found the advertisement. She came hobbling into the parsonage one rainy afternoon, holding a folded copy of the Matrimonial Times, her thin hands shaking with what she believed was answered prayer. "Read it, child," she said. "Read what the Lord has provided." Hannah read the small notice in the personal column. Christian gentleman banker and mine owner of considerable means in Wyoming Territory seeks Baptist wife of virtuous character, prefers young woman of good breeding, pledges full support of bride's family, travel paid in full, reply to Cyrus Blackwood, Blackwood, Wyoming territory. Hannah set the paper down. The room felt suddenly cold. "Auntie," she said quietly, "I do not know that man. Wyoming is very far away." Aunt Prudence took her hand. The old woman's eyes were wet. "Hannah, child, I have prayed and prayed. I cannot keep you. The deacons cannot keep you. This is the Lord's hand. A Christian man, a man of means, he will take care of you, and perhaps he can spare a small kindness for an old woman, so I do not have to enter the poor house." Hannah understood then. There was the choice. Marriage to a stranger in a place she could not even imagine, or watching her aunt die in a public charity home. She thought of her father, of his last words to her, the whispered prayer that the Lord would provide. Perhaps this was the providing. That night, Hannah went back to the cemetery. She knelt before her father's grave and lit a small white candle. The Charleston wind was warm and damp, carrying the smell of magnolia and salt. She bowed her head to pray. A sudden cold gust came from nowhere. The candle flame guttered and died. Hannah sat very still in the dark. Something cold moved up her spine, a feeling she could not name. It felt like a warning. It felt like her father somehow reaching from the other side of the veil to tell her something she could not hear. She squeezed the gold cross at her throat until the chain bit into her neck. But what could she do? There was no other path. She wrote her letter the next morning. 3 weeks later, a heavy money order arrived from Wyoming territory, along with a train ticket and a letter in elegant script. Cyrus Blackwood signed his name with a flourish like a duelist's signature. The letter was full of beautiful words about Christian companionship and frontier opportunity. Hannah read it 3 times. She told herself the cold she felt was only nerves. The train journey took 11 days. Hannah sat in the second-class car with her single trunk, watching the country change from green Carolina hills to flat Mississippi cotton fields to the endless prairies of Kansas and Nebraska. She had never imagined the world was so wide. She had never imagined she could feel so small inside it. On the 7th day, somewhere in western Nebraska, an old man took the seat across from her. He was perhaps 65, broad-shouldered and weather-beaten, with a long white beard and eyes the color of tobacco juice. He wore a heavy buffalo coat that smelled of wood smoke and tanned hides. He introduced himself as Hezekiah Boone, fur trader, headed back to his home in the high country after a season of selling pelts in St. Louis. He asked her name and her destination. When she said the words, "Blackwood, Wyoming," the old man went very still. His weathered face seemed to sag. He did not speak for a long moment. He looked out the window at the rolling brown grass. "Child," he said finally, his voice low and grave, "I have been through Blackwood twice, once last spring and once the summer before. I have heard things a young lady should not have to hear." Hannah felt her hands grow cold. "What things, Mr. Boone?" The old man turned his weathered eyes back to her. He seemed to be measuring his words. "I cannot rightly say. It is not my place. But I will tell you this, Miss Bellwether, and I want you to remember it. If you find yourself in trouble in that town, you go east. You go east into the Wind River Mountains. There are 3 brothers up there. Folks call them the Calloway brothers. They are quiet men. They keep to themselves, but they are honest men. The last honest men in that part of Wyoming. You remember that name, Calloway. You hear me, child?" Hannah nodded slowly. She did not understand, but she remembered the name. The old man stood up to leave. Before he walked away, he placed his rough hand on her shoulder. "I will pray for you, Miss Bellwether. The Lord has a way of putting the right people in our path. Sometimes we just have to recognize them when He does." Then he was gone. Hannah did not see him again on the train. She wondered if she had imagined him entirely. The town of Blackwood appeared at last on a gray November afternoon 4 days later. It was larger than Hannah had expected. Substantial wooden buildings lined the main street. There was a bank with stone columns, a hotel with 3 stories, several saloons, and a tall white church at the end of the street. Smoke curled from 100 chimneys. Snow had already fallen on the surrounding peaks, and the air was sharper and thinner than any air Hannah had ever breathed. A man stood waiting on the train platform. He was tall and lean, perhaps in his middle 40s, dressed in a charcoal gray suit of fine Eastern cloth. A heavy gold watch chain crossed his vest. His hair was dark and oiled, swept back from a high forehead, and his face was handsome in a sharp, hard way. He held a bouquet of white winter roses, somehow grown in some hothouse out here at the edge of the world. He saw her stepping down from the train, and he smiled. It was a beautiful smile, practiced and white. He came forward and took her hand and lifted it to his lips like a gentleman from a Charleston ballroom. "My dear Miss Bellwether," he said. His voice was deep and warm. "Cyrus Blackwood at your service. Welcome to Wyoming. Welcome home." Hannah managed a small smile. Up close, she noticed his eyes did not match the smile. They were pale gray, almost colorless, and they moved over her face and figure with a strange, evaluating coldness, as though he were inspecting livestock. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself she was tired from the long journey. The wedding was held that same evening at the white church at the end of Main Street. Cyrus said there was no need for delay. He said the train trip had been hard on her, and she should be settled into her new home. The minister, Reverend Ezra Whitmore, was a thin man with small eyes and a hurried manner. He read the vows so quickly, Hannah barely had time to say her amens. There were a dozen people in the pews, men and women Cyrus introduced as the leading citizens of Blackwood. They looked at Hannah with the same evaluating coldness as Cyrus, only paler and quieter. There was one woman who did not look at her that way. An older woman in a black bonnet stood near the back of the church holding a small child. Her face was lined with grief, and her eyes, when they met Hannah's, were full of pity. As Hannah walked back down the aisle on Cyrus's arm, the old woman crossed herself in a strange gesture, almost a backward sign of the cross, the kind of gesture old country folk made to ward off evil. Hannah's blood went cold. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that no one ought to make such a gesture at a Christian wedding. As they stepped outside, Hannah's eyes fell on the small church cemetery. She froze. 4 mounds of earth stood in a row by the cemetery wall. They were unmarked except for small wooden crosses. The mounds were of different ages. The oldest was settled and grass-covered. The newest was raw earth, perhaps only a few months old. Cyrus felt her hesitation. He followed her gaze. His gloved hand tightened on her arm. "Visitors," he said pleasantly. "Travelers who took ill on the road. We see to it that all souls are decently buried in Blackwood, my dear. It is a Christian town." He guided her firmly toward the waiting carriage. The Blackwood house sat at the end of Maple Street, a 3-story Victorian mansion painted dove gray with white trim and stained glass windows on the upper floors. Hannah had never seen such a house, not even in Charleston. The front parlor had a Persian rug deep enough to lose your foot in, and the dining table was set with English china and crystal goblets that caught the lamplight. A young Irish girl met them at the door. She was small and thin with red hair and freckles, perhaps 19 years old. She kept her eyes on the floor. "My maid Bridget Fenimore," Cyrus said. "She came to me last spring from Boston. A hard worker when she remembers her place. Bridget, prepare the bridal chamber and bring Mrs. Blackwood her supper." Bridget curtsied. As she rose, her eyes met Hannah's for one brief instant. There was something in those eyes that made Hannah's heart go still. It was the same pity she had seen in the old woman at the church, but it was something more. It was warning. The bridal chamber was on the second floor at the end of a long hallway. The room was beautiful. The bed had a canopy of white silk, and there was a small writing desk by the window and a velvet chair before the fire. Bridget set down a tray with cold meat and bread and a glass of wine. She moved to leave. "Wait," Hannah said softly. "Bridget, please, may I ask you something?" Bridget stopped. She did not turn around. After a moment, she spoke in a whisper that barely reached Hannah's ears. "Mrs. Blackwood, please, eat your supper. Lock your door if you can, and if he comes, do not fight him. It will be worse if you fight him." Then she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. Hannah sat very still on the edge of the canopied bed. She thought of the 4 graves. She thought of the old woman crossing herself. She thought of Mr. Boone on the train, telling her to remember the name Calloway. She thought of the cold wind that had blown out her father's candle. She understood then what her body had been trying to tell her for weeks. She had walked into a trap. The Lord had not provided. Or perhaps the Lord had been trying to warn her and she had not listened. She tried to lock her door. There was no lock. Cyrus came to her an hour later. He had been drinking. The bourbon and peppermint smell of him filled the room. He sat down heavily in the velvet chair before the fire, and he poured himself another glass from a crystal decanter she had not noticed. He looked at her with those pale gray eyes, and the warm smile from the train station was entirely gone. In its place was something cold and patient and hungry. "Sit down, Hannah," he said. She sat down on the edge of the bed. "You are too soft," Cyrus said. "Your father was a preacher. He filled your head with hymns in Sunday school. He did not teach you the true nature of the world, the true nature of marriage. So I will teach you. We will begin tonight." He stood up. He set his glass aside. He crossed the room. What happened next was the first lesson, as Cyrus called it. There was no whip, no blade, no shouting. Cyrus was a careful man. He struck her once with the back of his open hand hard enough to send her sprawling across the Persian rug. Then he knelt down beside her and explained in a low, calm voice the rules of his house. A wife was property. Property was silent. Property obeyed. Property did not weep, did not complain, did not run. Property that disobeyed was disciplined. Disciplined property learned in time to be useful. He did not strike her again that first night. He did not need to. The lesson had been delivered. When he left the room, Hannah lay on the rug for a long time. Her cheek throbbed. Her ear rang. She did not weep. She found she could not. The shock had taken her tears away. After perhaps an hour, she dragged herself up. She walked to the great wardrobe in the corner of the room. She did not know why. Some instinct guided her hand. She pulled open the heavy oak doors. Inside the wardrobe, hanging in a neat row, were 4 wedding dresses. Each one was different. The first was Boston-style lace trimmed perhaps from 1875. The second was simpler in the Pittsburgh fashion. The third had St. Louis embroidery. The fourth was newer, of soft white cotton with Atlanta lace. Each dress had a small dark stain on the collar. the kind of stain that does not wash out. 4 dresses, 4 graves in the cemetery, and now there would be a 5th dress hung beside them when Hannah was ready to be replaced. She closed the wardrobe doors. She walked back to the bed. She sat down. And finally, she began to weep into the pillow very quietly so that no one in the great gray house would hear her. The next morning, Bridget brought breakfast. She closed the bedroom door behind her and turned the heavy iron key that Cyrus had taken with him the night before the key that had been hidden in a drawer. Bridget had her own copy. "We have a few minutes," Bridget whispered. "He has gone to the bank." Hannah looked at her. There were others. "I, ma'am? 4 of them before you. Marjorie Sutcliffe of Boston, Cordelia Brennan of Pittsburgh, Philomena Vanderstein of St. Louis, Eulalie Tremaine of Atlanta. I buried 3 of them with my own hands. The undertaker buried the 4th, but I was there. They all died of fevers and falls and accidents that were not accidents." Hannah's hand shook. "How long have you been here?" "I came in February, ma'am. I have been here 9 months. "Why, Bridget? Why do you stay?" The Irish girl looked at the door for a long moment. Then she went to the writing desk in the corner of the room. She lifted a loose floorboard beneath the rug. She drew out a small leather pouch. She opened the pouch on the bed beside Hannah. Inside was a folded letter and a ring with a deep red garnet stone. "This was Eulalie's," Bridget whispered. "She gave it to me the night before she died. She said if another bride comes, give her this. Read what she wrote. She knew, you see. She knew what was coming." Hannah unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was cramped and desperate. She read aloud in a whisper. "If anyone reads this, know that I, Eulalie Tremaine of Atlanta, was murdered by Cyrus Blackwood. Before me he killed Marjorie, Cordelia, and Philomena. Find the Calloway brothers in the Wind River Mountains. They are the nephews of a man Cyrus killed for his land. They have been waiting for proof. Give them this ring as a sign that I sent it. May God have mercy on my soul. Eulalie Tremaine, 14th of June, 1878. Hannah looked up at Bridget. "The Calloway brothers?" "Aye, there are 3 of them. Triplets, they say. They live alone on a high mountain east of town. They do not come into Blackwood, but Mr. Boone, the fur trader, he knows them. He passes by their land on his way north. I have been waiting all these months for a way to send them this letter. I had no way to reach them. But you, ma'am, you are educated. You can write. We must find a way to get this letter to the mountains." Hannah held the garnet ring up to the lamplight. It caught the flame and held it like a small drop of blood. She thought of Mr. Boone on the train. Calloway. Remember the name. The Lord had been trying to provide after all. She had simply been too frightened to see his hand at work. She slid the ring onto a small chain and hid it beneath her collar. "We will find a way," she whispered to Bridget. "We will find a way." The winter of 1878 bled into the spring of 1879. Hannah learned the rhythm of survival. She learned to read Cyrus's moods like a sailor reads weather. A tightness around his mouth meant trouble was coming. A particular way he set down his glass meant the storm had arrived. She learned to be silent. She learned to be invisible. She learned to clean the blood from her own lips with cold water and to apply raw beef to her bruised ribs to bring out the swelling. The beatings came once or twice a month. Cyrus was always careful never to strike her face if there was a town function the following day. He aimed for the belly, the thighs, the small of the back, places where the bruises could be hidden under high-collared dresses and woolen shawls. He told the dressmaker, Mrs. Adelaide Whitlow, that Hannah was clumsy. Hannah, when asked, agreed. She was so clumsy. She fell downstairs. She walked into doors. Mrs. Whitlow's eyes filled with tears, but Mrs. Whitlow said nothing. Mrs. Whitlow had a daughter to feed. The town knew. Hannah understood this slowly through 100 small signs. The way other women crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. The way the bartender's wife pressed an extra biscuit into her basket without comment. The way old men in the saloon stopped speaking when she walked past the open door. They knew. They all knew. And they did nothing because Cyrus Blackwood owned the bank and the mortgages and the line of credit at the mercantile and the silver mine where their sons worked. He owned them all, so they looked away. In April, Hannah ran. She had taken a beating worse than usual after Cyrus had quarreled with a railroad agent. She had felt something break inside her low in her belly, and she had bled for 2 days. Bridget told her later that it had been a child she had not known she was carrying. Hannah did not weep for the child. The child would not have lived in that house anyway. She ran in her nightgown, barefoot in the gray mud of an early Wyoming spring. She ran to the office of Sheriff Tobias Crow. He was a fat man with a tin star and a drooping yellow mustache. He sat her down by his stove. He gave her coffee. He listened to her story with sad eyes. Then he stood up. He put on his hat. He hitched his wagon, and he drove her home to Cyrus. "It ain't my business, Mrs. Blackwood," he said as the wagon rolled through the muddy street. "What goes on between man and wife? That ain't the law's business. The law ends at a man's front door." Cyrus stood waiting on the porch. He smiled. He paid the sheriff $100 in gold coin. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode away without looking back. That night, Cyrus chained Hannah to the bedpost with an iron manacle he had brought up from the cellar. He left her there for 3 days. Bridget brought water when she could. Hannah did not run again. She had learned. There was no help in Blackwood. There was no law, no church, no neighbor who would lift a finger. The only help in the world lay east of town, on a mountain she had never seen, in the hands of 3 brothers whose faces she could not picture. She had to find a way to reach them. 20 miles to the east, high on the eastern slope of the Wind River Mountains, the 3 Calloway brothers were finishing the last of the spring fence repairs. Their valley was a hidden bowl in the mountains, ringed by granite cliffs and pine forest, with a hot spring that steamed all winter and a clear creek running through the meadow. They called it Calloway Hollow, and they had built it with their own hands over the course of 12 years. Jedediah Calloway, the eldest by 7 minutes, drove a wooden post into the soft earth with a heavy iron maul. He was 28 years old, 6 feet 7 inches tall in his moccasins, with shoulders broad as a barn door. His amber eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen too much before he had finished growing. He had a long, pale scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline, a souvenir from the Wilderness Campaign in May of 1864. He had been 13 years old when he lied his way into the Union Army. He had served 7 months. He had killed his first man at 13 and his 5th man at 14, and his parents had come and dragged him home before the war was done. He did not speak of those 7 months, not even to his brothers. Ezekiel Calloway, the middle brother, was sighting along the line of the fence to make sure the posts were straight. He carried an old leather Bible in his hip pocket, and he read from it every morning by the spring. He had not laughed, his brothers said, in 12 years, not since the day they came home from a hunt to find their parents dead and their land stolen by a man named Cyrus Blackwood. Zeke believed in the patience of the Lord. He believed with a stillness that frightened other men that vengeance belonged to God, but that God sometimes used the hands of his servants. Nathaniel Calloway, the youngest by another 7 minutes, was working the bellows in the small log forge by the creek. He was the only one of the three who still smiled. He was the only one who could play a tune on the banjo that hung by his bunk. He set Bones brewed teas from mountain herbs, doctored horses and dogs, and the occasional human stranger who wandered up the wagon trace, lost. He had been the gentle one as a child, and 12 years of hard mountain living had not entirely killed the gentleness in him. The three of them were identical to look at. Same height, same shoulders, same chestnut hair, same amber eyes. Strangers could not tell them apart. Friends knew Jed by his scar, Zeke by the Bible at his hip, and Nate by the small chip in his front tooth. They had built Calloway Hollow into a substantial little holding, a 3-room cabin of squared pine logs, a barn for the horses, a smithy, a vegetable garden their mother would have been proud of. A tiny chapel that Zeke had built one summer with rough-hewn pews for 10 and a wooden cross above the altar. They ran a small herd of cattle, trapped beaver in winter, and panned a little silver out of the creek when they needed cash money in town. Their nearest neighbor, an old wagon train scout named Whitaker, lived in a tiny cabin 5 miles down the slope. Old Whitaker had been a friend of their father's. He was 65 now, still strong as a tree root, and he watched over the brothers in the silent way of mountain men, leaving small gifts of fresh meat or news on their porch, never knocking, never staying. Once a year, in the early summer, old Whitaker came down to Calloway Hollow with news from town. He brought it like a man brings unwelcome medicine, slow and careful. This particular summer of 1879, old Whitaker rode up the trace on a Tuesday morning. He hitched his mule. He sat on the porch step. He pulled a folded letter from his coat and laid it on the boards beside him. He waited until Jed and Zeke and Nate had all come down from their work and gathered around him. "Hez Boone come to me last week," the old man said. "Said he was passing through Blackwood, and a young woman gave him this letter, sealed and waxed. Said it was for the Calloway brothers. Said it was urgent. Hez gave it to me to bring up the mountain." Jed picked up the letter. He broke the wax seal. He unfolded the paper. There were 2 pieces of paper inside. The first was the original letter from Eulalie Tremaine. The second was a new letter written in a different hand in beautiful, careful script. Jed read it aloud. "My name is Hannah Mae Bellwether Blackwood. I am 22 years old. I am the 5th bride of Cyrus Blackwood. The previous 4 are dead. I enclose a letter from the 4th Eulalie Tremaine, with her ring as proof. I do not know if I will live to send another letter. My maid Bridget Fenimore will try to bring this to the trader Mr. Boone. If you are who Eulalie said you are, the nephews of a man Cyrus killed for his land, then we share an enemy. I do not ask you to save me. I only ask when I am gone that you remember our names, Marjorie, Cordelia, Philomena, Eulalie, and Hannah. Pray for our souls, and if the Lord grants you the chance, see that justice is done. Yours in Christ, Hannah Mae." Jed lowered the letter. The 3 brothers stood very still on the porch. The summer wind moved through the pines. Zeke spoke first. 12 years, Lord. You have brought us a witness." Nate's voice was hoarse. "She is alive, Jed. She is alive right now. We can ride for her tonight." Jed looked at the garnet ring in his palm, the small drop of blood from a dead woman in Atlanta. He closed his fist around it. "Not tonight," he said. "She would die before we got her clear. Cyrus has men. The sheriff, the reverend. Half the town owes him money. We ride down there now, we ride into a hornet's nest, and she dies the first hour. We need a different way." He looked at old Whitaker. "Can you get word back to her quietly?" The old scout nodded slowly. "Hesboon goes through twice a month, carries letters for folks. He could get a small thing to the maid." Jed thought for a long moment. Then he walked into the cabin and came out with a small brass bell no larger than a man's fist. It had hung by their mother's kitchen door 12 years ago in another life. He had kept it in a drawer ever since. "Send her this," he said. "Send word with it. Tell her to hang it in her window when the time comes, when he is hurting her bad, when she cannot bear another night. We will be watching the town from the high ridge. We will see the bell from the top of Cathedral Peak with the spyglass when the lamplight catches it. When that bell hangs in her window, we come down the mountain, all three of us, and we end this." Old Whitaker took the bell. He nodded once. He rode back down the trace. The bell reached Hannah in early August, smuggled in a sack of flour from Mr. Boone's wagon by Bridget. Hannah held the small brass thing in her palm, and she wept. Not in despair this time. She wept because the Lord had answered after all, slowly, through fur traders and Irish maids and 3 strangers on a mountain. But he had answered. She hid the bell under her mattress. She did not ring it yet. Not yet. She would only ring it when there was no other choice. She would ring it when she was certain that not ringing it meant death. The autumn came. The aspens turned gold on the slopes. The first snow fell on the high peaks. Cyrus Blackwood received bad news from the railroad. The Denver and Rio Grande Western had decided to bypass Blackwood by 10 miles. His freight monopoly, his land speculation, the entire architecture of his fortune began to crumble. He grew silent. He drank more. He watched Hannah across the dinner table with eyes that no longer pretended at warmth. She knew the storm was coming. She did not know which night. It came on the 20th of December, 1879. A blizzard had been blowing for 3 days, burying the town in drifts up to the second-story windows. The wind howled like a thing alive. Hannah was sewing by the parlor fire when she heard Cyrus's heavy boots on the porch. He slammed the front door so hard the windows rattled. He did not take off his snow-caked overcoat. He walked across the parlor in 3 long strides, his face dark red with rage, his eyes black and empty. He struck her with the back of his fist. She flew sideways into the stone hearth. Her temple struck the iron fire dog. The world went white. She tasted blood. She heard him distantly as though through deep water. He was shouting. The mine was failing. The railroad was lost. She had cost him everything. She was a barren, useless thing. He was going to throw her into the snow tonight and let the cold finish what he should have finished long ago. Hannah fought through the white static in her head. She crawled across the rug. Her hand found the small brass bell on the mantel where she had moved it a week ago, hidden behind a vase. Her fingers closed around it. She knocked it to the floor. The bell rang, just once. A small, thin sound almost lost in the howl of the wind, but Bridget was in the kitchen. Bridget heard. The Irish girl ran into the parlor, snatched the bell from the floor, and fled up the stairs before Cyrus could turn. She pushed open the second-story window. The snow blasted into the room. With trembling fingers, she tied the leather cord of the bell to the window latch. She closed the window down on the cord, leaving the bell swinging on the outside of the glass in the screaming wind. The bell rang. Once, twice, 12 times, 100, lost in the storm. 20 miles to the east on a high ridge above Callaway Hollow. Ezekiel Callaway stood in the snow with a brass spyglass pressed to his eye. He had been standing there for 3 nights, running every night since the storm began. He did not feel the cold. He was praying as he watched. He saw it. A tiny glint of brass in a window on Maple Street swinging in the storm, catching the lamplight from inside the house. He lowered the glass. He turned and ran down the slope to the cabin, his boots breaking the deep snow. He burst through the door. Jed was cleaning his Sharps buffalo rifle by the fire. Nate was tuning the banjo. Zeke spoke one word. "Bell." Jed set down the rifle. He stood up. His amber eyes were very calm. "Saddle the horses." Outside the cabin, the wind howled down off the peaks. 3 tall men in heavy bearskin coats stepped out into the blizzard, each one armed, each one silent. They mounted 3 big mountain horses, bred for snow. They rode down the trace at a steady, terrible pace. 3 identical riders disappearing into the white storm, riding toward the small town 20 miles away, where a small brass bell was ringing in a window. 12 years of waiting was over. The reckoning had begun. The blizzard swallowed the 3 riders within 100 yards of the cabin. Snow blew sideways across the trace in white sheets, and the wind shrieked through the pines like a thing wounded. The horses moved with their heads low, breaking the deep drifts step by step. Jedediah Callaway rode in the lead, his amber eyes narrowed to slits, reading the country by memory rather than sight. The trace had vanished hours ago beneath the drifts. He knew it the way a sailor knows the sea by the shape of ridges and the lay of creek beds and the angle of certain ancient pines. Ezekiel rode in the middle. He carried a long Sharps buffalo rifle wrapped in oilcloth across his saddle and a pair of Colt revolvers in cross-draw holsters under his bearskin coat. His leather Bible rode in his hip pocket, as it always did even in war. He had not spoken since he had come down off the ridge with the spyglass. He was praying as he rode the old psalms his mother had taught him, the ones about justice and deliverance and the breaking of the rod of the oppressor. Nathaniel rode last, watching the back trail. He carried a doctor's leather bag lashed to his saddle behind the bedroll. He had packed it himself before they left. Bandages, whiskey for cleaning wounds, catgut and curved needles, laudanum, a small bottle of the willow bark tincture he brewed every autumn. He had not asked his brothers what condition they expected to find the woman in. He did not need to ask. He had read her letter. The 20 miles took them 7 hours. The storm was at its worst when they reached the East Ridge above Blackwood, the ridge where old Whitaker had a small lookout cabin and a corral. They left the horses there. They went down into town on foot, 3 tall shadows breaking through the drifts, 3 big men moving through the howling white toward Maple Street. It was nearly 4 in the morning when they reached the gray Victorian house at the end of the street. The bell still hung in the upper window, ringing fitfully in the wind. The whole town was dark and locked up. No one came out. No one looked through a curtain. No one wanted to see. Jed paused at the foot of the porch steps. He drew a long breath. He looked at his brothers. "We do not kill him," he said. His voice was very quiet. "We bring him out alive. We hand him to a federal court. He hangs in front of every man who took his money." Zeke nodded once. "The Lord requires justice, not slaughter." Nate's face was pale. "And if he has hurt her past saving?" Jed's amber eyes hardened. "Then we leave him for the wolves and tell no man what we did." He turned and went up the porch steps. The heavy oak front door was bolted from the inside. Jed did not knock. He took 3 steps back, lowered his shoulder, and threw 230 pounds of mountain man against the door at a dead run. The frame split. The hinges tore loose from the jam. The door crashed inward and slammed flat against the parlor floor with a sound like a gunshot. The blizzard followed them through the broken doorway. Snow swirled into the parlor. The oil lamps on the mantel guttered and died. Only the fireplace gave light, throwing tall orange shadows across the velvet drapes. Cyrus Blackwood stood in the middle of the room. He had his hands fisted in the collar of Hannah's dressing gown. He had been dragging her toward the back door, meaning to throw her out into the storm to die. The crash of the front door spun him around. He let go of her. She slid down to the rug, leaving a long red smear behind her on the floorboards. For one long second, Cyrus stared at the 3 identical men in the doorway. 3 faces the same. 3 bearskin coats white with snow. 3 pairs of amber eyes catching the firelight. His memory worked slowly through the bourbon. A summer day in 1867. A wagon trip out to a homestead at the head of the valley. 3 boys he had paid 2 men to find and kill 3 boys who had not been at the cabin when his men arrived. 3 boys he had assumed dead in the woods or run off back east. The color drained from his face. "Calloway," he whispered. Jedediah took 1 slow step into the room. "You remember our father Cyrus?" "I do not." His name was Tobias Calloway. He came up from Tennessee in 1866 with my mother Mary Beth and the 3 of us. 200 acres at the head of Blackwood Valley. You forged a deed in 1867. He went to ride to the territorial recorder in Cheyenne. You sent 2 men ahead. They shot him through the back at the river crossing. They came back to our cabin, and they shot our mother where she stood in her own kitchen. We 3 were in the high country hunting elk. We came home and we buried them. We were 16 years old. Cyrus's hand began to shake. He took a step backward. His eyes went to the writing desk by the window to the top drawer where his nickel-plated Colt waited. He never reached it. Jed crossed the room in 2 strides and took him by the throat and lifted him off the floor with 1 hand. 200 pounds of banker came up like a child. Cyrus's hands flew to Jed's wrist. His manicured nails broke against weather-hardened skin. His tooled leather boots kicked at empty air. Jed's face was very close to his own, the smell of pine and cold iron and old gunpowder. 12 years, Cyrus. Every winter, every spring, we watched this town from the ridge with a glass. We counted your weddings. We counted your funerals. Marjorie, Cordelia, Philomena, Eulalie. 4 women in unmarked graves behind the church. We could not prove what you had done. The law in this town belongs to you. So we waited. We waited for a witness who could speak your name in a federal court. He set Cyrus down. He drove 1 fist into Cyrus's left side. There was a wet cracking sound, 3 ribs giving way. Cyrus folded over, choking. He went to his knees on the Persian rug, blood foaming at the corner of his mouth. Jed stepped back. "Get up. You walk out of this house on your own feet, or my brother carries you on a sled. You face a judge in Cheyenne. You hang where Tobias and Mary Beth Calloway can see it from heaven." While Jed dealt with Cyrus, Nathaniel had already crossed to Hannah. He knelt on the rug beside her. She tried to flinch away. Her one good eye looked up at him through a veil of blood from a deep gash at her hairline. The other eye was swollen shut. "Easy now, Mrs. Blackwood." His voice was the low, gentle voice he used on injured horses. "My name is Nate Calloway. We got your letter. We have come for you. No one is going to hurt you again." Her cracked lips moved. "Bridget." "Where is she, ma'am?" "Kitchen." She rang the bell. Nate looked up at Zeke. Zeke moved silently down the hall toward the back of the house. He came back a moment later, half carrying the Irish maid who was bleeding from a cut on her temple where Cyrus had struck her with a fire poker an hour earlier. Bridget Fenimore could walk just barely. Zeke set her down gently in a parlor chair and went to fetch his brother's medical bag. Nate worked over Hannah on the rug. His hands were huge and rough, but they moved with a delicacy that did not match the rest of him. He cleaned the gash on her temple with whiskey. He felt down her ribs and her left arm. The arm was broken cleanly above the wrist. 2 ribs were cracked but not displaced. There were older injuries beneath the new ones, yellow and green bruises layered like an old painting. He kept his face still while he found them. His brothers did not need to see what he was seeing. "Can you stand Mrs. Blackwood?" "I think so, with help." "Your name is not Mrs. Blackwood any longer. He is going to a courthouse. You are coming home with us. What is your given name?" "Hannah." "Hannah, then." He helped her to her feet. The bearskin coat he draped around her shoulders was 3 sizes too large. It swallowed her like a child in a man's blanket. She smelled the wood smoke and pine and animal scent of it, and for the first time in 13 months she felt warm. Outside in the blizzard, a horse came up Maple Street at a gallop, boots on the porch. Sheriff Tobias Crow pushed through the broken doorway with a double-barreled shotgun in his hands, and 2 deputies behind him, half-dressed, blinking sleep from their eyes. The lamps from the saloon down the street had finally roused them. Blackwood had taken its time about waking up to the sound of the door breaking. "Hands up, every one of you!" Crow shouted. His voice was high and trembling. He was not a brave man. He was a man who had been comfortable a long time. "You are under arrest for break-in and enter-in and assault on the person of Mr. Cyrus Blackwood. Step away from him." Zeke Calloway did not move. He looked at the sheriff for a long moment. Then his right hand drifted almost lazily to the bone-handled Bowie knife at his hip. The throw was so fast that none of them saw it. The blade flickered across the room and stuck deep in the wooden doorframe an inch from the sheriff's right ear, pinning his coat sleeve to the wood. Crow yelped and dropped the shotgun. Jed walked toward him slowly. His amber eyes were calm. Sheriff Tobias Crow, April 14th, 1879. You drove this woman home in your wagon after she came to you for help, and you took $100 in gold from her husband for your trouble. July 2nd, 1878. The body of Eulalie Tremaine was buried in the church cemetery without an inquest, and you signed the death certificate with your name. September of 1877, you signed a similar paper for Philomena Vandersteen. October of 1876 for Cordelia Brennan. May of 1875 for Marjorie Sutcliffe. 4 murders, 4 signatures. We have copies of every paper you ever signed for Cyrus Blackwood. They have been in a strong box in our cabin for 2 years. Crow's face had gone the color of wet ashes. "How?" he whispered. "Old Whitaker," Jed said. "He was on the burial detail at the 3rd one. He kept the paperwork. Now you are coming to Cheyenne with us. You will testify. If you testify true, the federal judge may give you life in Yuma instead of the rope. That is a better deal than you ever gave any of those women." The 2 deputies behind Crow had not moved. They were young men. They had never signed a forged death certificate. They had sat in the saloon and looked the other way, but they had not signed anything. They lowered their hands slowly. One of them spoke. "Mr. Calloway, we did not know about the women. We swear before God we did not know." "Then go home," Jed said. "Tell no man what you saw here tonight. If you breathe a word, I will know. I have eyes in this town that you do not know about. Go home." The deputies fled into the storm. Bridget had gathered up a small bundle of Hannah's things, what she could carry: the gold cross of Hannah's mother, the garnet ring of Eulalie Tremaine, a Bible, 2 woolen dresses, a pair of stout boots from the back of a closet. She brought them to the parlor and stood quietly waiting. Zeke gave her his own scarf for her cut head and helped her into a heavy wool coat from the front closet, one that had belonged to one of the dead brides. Cyrus was bound at the wrists with rawhide cord. He lay on the rug, breathing shallowly, his shattered ribs stabbing him with every breath. He looked up at Jed with eyes full of pure, cold hatred. "You will not get me to Cheyenne Calloway. The pass is closed. The drifts are 40 feet deep at the saddle. You will die in the storm before you ever see a federal judge, and my men will come. Your men are buying drinks at the saloon and hoping no one mentions your name when this is done," Jed said. "But you are right about the pass. We are not riding to Cheyenne tonight. We are riding to the Hollow. You will winter in our root cellar with your hands on a chain. When the pass opens in May, we ride. Until then, you live on hard biscuit and lukewarm water, and you think about Marjorie and Cordelia and Philomena and Eulalie. Maybe by spring you will have something to say in your own defense. I doubt it." He hauled Cyrus to his feet. He marched him out the broken doorway into the blizzard. Old Whitaker was waiting at the east edge of town with a sled and 4 spare horses. He had ridden down from his lookout when he saw the bell ringing. He had not asked any questions. He had simply harnessed the team. They lashed Cyrus to the sled, wrapped Hannah and Bridget in 3 blankets each, and started the long climb back up toward the Hollow. The storm broke just before sunrise. The sky cleared to a deep, painful blue. The Wind River Mountains stood up in the new light, white and silent and enormous, the peaks edged in pink. Hannah, half conscious in the sled, watched the sky come open above her. She had not seen a sky like that in 13 months. She closed her one good eye, and she let 2 tears slide down the bruised side of her face. She did not have the strength to weep more than that. She did not remember the last hours of the ride. When she woke, she was lying on a bed of layered elk hides in a small, clean room that smelled of pine and wood smoke. A fire was going in a stone hearth. A heavy quilt was tucked up to her chin. Her broken arm was set in willow splints and bound to her chest. Her ribs were tightly wrapped. The cut at her hairline had been stitched with neat black sutures. A young man with chestnut hair and amber eyes sat by the fire reading a book. He looked up when she stirred. "You are awake," Nate said softly. 3 days now. Your fever broke last night. You will live, Hannah." She tried to speak. Her throat was too dry. He brought her water in a tin cup and held it to her lips. "Where is he?" she whispered. "In the root cellar at the back of the cabin, chained to a beam, eating cold biscuit. My brother Zeke takes him bread and water once a day and reads scripture at him. Cyrus Blackwood does not enjoy the readings." A small ghost of a smile touched the corner of Hannah's swollen mouth. It was the first smile she had attempted in over a year. Her face had nearly forgotten how. "Bridget." In the next room, healing. She has decided she wants to learn to shoot. Jed says he will teach her in the spring. And the others. Sheriff Crow. "Locked in our smokehouse with a deputy from Lander we sent for by Ryder yesterday morning. Crow is making himself very cooperative. He has begun to write down names. The names of every man in Blackwood who took money from Cyrus over the last 12 years. The list is long. The federal marshal will have a busy summer in Wyoming. Hannah lay quietly for a long time. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped in a paddock. She could hear the faint sound of an axe splitting wood. She did not know what to say to this gentle giant who had saved her life. "Why?" she said finally. "Why did you come for me?" Nate set his book aside. He looked into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before. "My mother used to tell us a story when we were very small. She had a sister, a younger sister, who left Tennessee in 1855 to marry a Baptist preacher in Charleston. There was a falling out. The preacher did not approve of our father's people. He cut our mother off. We never met that sister, but our mother kept a photograph of her on the shelf above the kitchen stove. She would touch the frame sometimes. She would say, 'Your Aunt Sarah is praying for us boys. She is praying for us all the way across the country.'" Hannah went very still under the quilt. Nate reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch on a cord. He drew from it a tintype photograph. He held it out to her. She knew the photograph before she touched it. She had seen it 1,000 times in her father's Bible drawer. A tall, blonde woman with kind eyes, standing beside a man Hannah had never been able to identify. She had not understood all those years why her father had kept a photograph he refused to explain. "That is my mother," she whispered. "Sarah Bellwether." "Sarah Calloway," Nate said. "Born in 1831, Greene County, Tennessee. Younger sister to our father Tobias by 4 years. Married a preacher in Charleston in 1855. Died there in childbirth in 1856, leaving behind a baby daughter named Hannah May." The room tilted slightly around her. "You are our cousin Hannah. You have been our cousin all your life, and we did not know. When your letter came last summer, the writing on the envelope did not mean anything to us. But 3 weeks ago, when Cyrus drank too much at the saloon and bragged to a stranger that his 5th wife was a Charleston preacher's orphan, that stranger was our friend Hez Boone, and he came back up the trace as fast as a fur trader's mule would carry him. Boone had known our father back in the Tennessee days before any of us boys were born. He had hauled hides for our grandfather one summer in '54. He remembered there had been a younger sister named Sarah, a quiet girl with cornflower eyes who had married a Charleston preacher and gone east. He had been trying to remember the whole train ride from St. Louis to Wyoming, why the preacher's name on your ticket had sounded familiar. It came to him only after he had left you on the platform. She closed her eye. The tears came hot and fast. She had not known she had any tears left in the world. She had a family. She had cousins. She had blood. After 22 years of believing she was alone in the world, she had blood, and that blood had ridden through a blizzard to take her home. Nate reached out and laid his rough hand very carefully over her good one, on top of the quilt. "Sleep now, cousin. There is time enough for everything. You are home." The winter passed slowly, the way winters do in the Wind River high country. The drifts climbed past the cabin windows. The hot spring steamed day and night. The stars at midnight burned so cold and bright they seemed close enough to cut your hand. Hannah healed. Her arm came out of the splint at 6 weeks. The ribs set true. The cut at her hairline closed to a thin pink line that her honey blonde hair would soon hide. She ate the food Nate cooked venison stews thick with onions and dried corn biscuits with mountain honey eggs from the cabin's 3 hens' milk from the brown cow Zeke had named Patience. The hollow places under her cheekbones filled out. The voluptuous softness she had been before Cyrus came back slowly day by day. Nate took quiet pride in feeding her well. He said a body that had been starved of love and bred together needed both put back at the same table. By the middle of January, she was strong enough to come into the main room and sit by the fire in the evenings. The four of them, the three brothers and Hannah with Bridget, often joining once her own strength returned, kept long, quiet vigils through the dark nights. Zeke read the Psalms aloud. Nate played slow tunes on the banjo old Tennessee ballads their mother had sung. Jed mostly listened, mending tack or cleaning a rifle, the firelight catching the long scar at his temple. When she was strong enough to walk a quarter mile, Jed began to teach her to shoot. "A wolf does not care that you are a woman, Hannah. Neither do the men your husband sent for in Cheyenne 3 weeks ago. We had a rider tell us, a bounty man named Marcus Doyle, Mac Doyle out of Cheyenne, 42 confirmed kills last we heard. He will come up here in the spring with 8 or 10 guns." He set a Sharps buffalo rifle in her hands. It was almost too heavy for her at first. He showed her how to brace it, how to breathe out all the way out until your lungs were empty and very still, how to squeeze rather than pull. She practiced through January and February, every clear afternoon, on pine cones at 50 yards and tin cans at 100. By March, she could put a ball through a pine cone at 150 paces without thinking about it. Her shoulder turned black and yellow with bruises, but the bruises did not bother her. They were honest bruises. They were her own bruises this time. Zeke taught her tracking, how to read a fresh deer print from an old one, how to tell a man's print from a boy's, how to walk on pine duff so that you left no track at all, how to find water by reading the slope of the land. She began to walk the woods around the hollow with him on the calmer days. She watched him kneel and brush snow aside and read the story of the morning out of a half-dozen tracks no other person would have seen. She began slowly to read those stories herself. Nate taught her medicine, the names of the mountain herbs, the bark teas for fever, the poultices for bruises, the ointments for burns. He taught her how to clean a wound, how to sew skin, how to set a bone. He taught her in the same low, gentle voice he had used the first night. She found herself watching the way the firelight caught the chip in his front tooth when he smiled. She found herself listening for his footstep on the porch when he came in from the barn. She did not say anything to anyone about this. She did not have to. Jed and Zeke saw it and said nothing and approved with their silence. In late February, on a clear, cold afternoon, Hannah walked out alone for the first time. She walked up the slope behind the cabin to a small bench of land where 2 pine trees stood close together. There were 2 graves there marked with cairns of river stones. Tobias Calloway, born 1824, died 1867. Mary Beth Calloway, born 1827, died 1867. The brothers had brought their parents up the mountain 4 years after the murders, the year they had found and reburied them, when the hollow was finally safe enough. Hannah knelt in the snow. She put her hand on the cold stones of her aunt and uncle's graves. She had never met them. She had not known they existed until 2 months ago. "I am here," she said softly. "I am Sarah's daughter. I am home." The wind moved gently in the high pines. She bowed her head and prayed for a long time. The bad news came on a Tuesday in early March. Old Whitaker came up the trace on his mule with a federal courier behind him. The courier was a young man from the marshal's office in Cheyenne, and he carried 2 letters wrapped in oilcloth. The first letter was from the United States Marshal. It said that the federal warrant for Cyrus Blackwood had been issued. The marshal would send 4 deputies up the trace to take Cyrus into custody as soon as the high pass cleared, which they expected by the 2nd week of May. He would be tried in Cheyenne. The 4 bride murders, the murder of Tobias and Mary Beth Calloway, the forgery of the homestead deed conspiracy with public officials. Sheriff Crow had filled 6 pages of testimony. Crow would receive 25 years in the territorial prison if he held to his statement. The second letter was different. It bore no return address. It was addressed in a sloping hand to the brothers Calloway Wind River. Inside was a single sheet of expensive paper. Gentlemen, by the time you read this, Cyrus Blackwood will have escaped his confinement. 2 of your federal couriers are not federal couriers. They are men in my employ. The pass will be opened by my crew with black powder 10 days before you expect it. Mac Doyle has been hired. He will bring 8 men and 1 Hotchkiss machine cannon. We will be at the head of your valley on the morning of the 18th of May. You may surrender the woman, or you may bury your brothers. The choice is yours. C.B. Jed read the letter twice. He passed it to Zeke. Zeke passed it to Nate. Nate set it down on the table. He has a man inside the marshal's office, Zeke said quietly. He has had men inside that office for years, Jed said. He did not have time to use them before. Now he has time. It does not matter. We have time too. Hannah was standing by the stove. She had been pouring coffee. She set the pot down very carefully. He will have escaped already by the time we read this. He may already be somewhere on this mountain. Jed shook his head. No, he will go to Cheyenne first. He needs Doyle. He needs the cannon. He cannot move that gun in winter. He will gather his men in Cheyenne and come up the trace when the snow is breaking. 18th of May. We have 10 weeks. To do what? To prepare a welcome. He went to the rough-cut table. He spread out a hand-drawn map of the head of Calloway Hollow. He laid his finger on the narrow gorge that was the only way in for a wagon and a mounted column. They will come up the trace through the gorge. They have to. The cannon cannot go off-trail. We choose every yard of ground. We choose every angle. We choose every tree. By the 18th of May, we will know that gorge so well we could walk it blindfolded. They will not. That same afternoon, old Whitaker rode out with 3 letters. One went down to Mr. Hez Boone at his trading post on the Sweetwater. The others went to 7 different cabins scattered through the Wind River high country. The brothers had spent 12 years up here. They had not made many friends, but they had made the right ones. Within 2 weeks, the answers began to come back. A man named Caleb Mossbrook rode in on a paint mare. A Tennessee Confederate veteran, 53 years old, who had lost his wife and 2 daughters in 1872 when Cyrus Blackwood had paid a bunch of drovers to burn out his homestead. Mossbrook had run cattle in the same valley as the Calloways. He had been waiting for this letter for 7 years. He carried 2 Henry rifles and a French dueling pistol that had killed 11 men in his lifetime. A trapper named Reuben Pickett came down off the Absaroka with a string of 3 Indian ponies and a younger brother's name carved on the stock of his rifle. Cyrus had hung that brother for a horse he had not stolen back in '76. Silas Tatum, a ruined homesteader with 3 living sons, came up from the lower Sweetwater. Tatum had been swindled out of 3 sections of grass in '74. He brought the 3 sons. Each of them carried a Spencer carbine and a face that did not smile. Beauregard Larkin rode in from Lander. Beau Larkin had once been a Pinkerton man. He had quit the agency in '77 over a case that smelled wrong. The case had involved a Wyoming banker named Blackwood. Bo Larkin had been investigating the matter on his own time ever since. A blacksmith named Joshua Drum walked the 18 miles from his forge at the foot of the trace, carrying a long Whitworth rifle and a heart full of a story he did not tell anyone, but whose name he carved on a slip of paper and laid on the cabin table. The name was Eulalie Tremaine. Drum had been her uncle, his sister's only daughter. Otis Pemberton, a gold panner with a face like a leather mask and a temper like a wolverine, came up from the southern slopes. He hated Cyrus Blackwood for an entirely private reason involving a brother-in-law and a stake in a silver claim, but his hate was clean and steady, and he was a fine pistol shot. Wendell Hightower, an old Union cavalryman from Pennsylvania, who now ran a small horse ranch on the South Fork, rode up on his best gelding. Cyrus had once tried to take his land. He had not succeeded. Hightower wished to make sure Cyrus would never try again. Arlo Gantry came last, a wolf hunter who lived alone 3 days deep in the backcountry. Gantry had killed 100 wolves with a single-shot rifle. He did not say why he came. He did not have to. By the 1st of April, there were 11 men camped in and around Callaway Hollow. They slept in tents and lean-tos. They worked all day under Jed's quiet command. They knew what was coming. They knew the odds. None of them turned back. Hannah cooked for them. Bridget cooked alongside her. The 2 women fed 11 men 3 times a day on venison and beans and biscuits and coffee and wild greens, and they did not complain. And they kept a Bible on the kitchen shelf and a Winchester rifle beside the stove. In the first week of April, Bridget came to Hannah one evening at the hearth. The Irish girl looked at the floor for a long moment. "Hannah, there is a thing I have not told you about my coming to Blackwood. It was not the way Mr. Blackwood thought. I did not come to that house as an ordinary maid. I was sent." Hannah set down her sewing. "My older brother is Sean Fenimore. He is a federal investigator out of Cheyenne. He has been working on Blackwood for 3 years. He could not get a warrant without an inside witness. He sent me in. The understanding was that I would gather what I could and find a way out before any harm came to me. The harm came faster than we expected. I was not able to send my reports. I have copies of letters between Cyrus and a senator out of Washington. I have his private ledger in my satchel right now. I should have told you sooner." Hannah looked at the small Irish girl for a long moment. Then she smiled, very tired and very kind. "Bridget, you saved my life. You rang the bell. The rest is for Jed and Zeke and Sean to argue out by lamplight. I do not care how you came. I care that you came." Bridget cried, then quietly into her apron. She had not allowed herself to cry in 9 months. In the second week of April, old Whitaker came up the trace with hard news. A man's body had been found in a snowbank a mile outside of Blackwood, frozen rigid, stripped of his coat and boots. The man was Reverend Ezra Whitmore. Cyrus had killed him before he left Blackwood. The Reverend had begun to lose his nerve and had begun to talk in his cups about certain entries in certain church burial books. Cyrus had silenced him with a single shot to the back of the head. Inside the dead man's coat lining, sewn there in a moment of frightened conscience 2 weeks before his death, was a folded letter. The letter was Cyrus Blackwood's last note to himself. It listed dates and amounts paid to officials in Cheyenne and Washington. It listed the names of the 4 murdered brides and the dates of their deaths. It listed Tobias and Mary Beth Calloway with a small note in the margin. Land, 200 acres, head of valley. It was a confession written to no one, a banker's accounting of his own black ledger. Old Whitaker brought it up the trace wrapped in oilcloth and laid it in Jed's hand without a word. Jed read it through twice. He passed it to Zeke. Zeke read it. He closed the paper. "The Lord works slow," Zeke said, "but the Lord works." Hannah came to the table. She read the letter herself. She came to the line about her aunt and uncle. She read it twice. She walked outside and stood for a long time looking up at the snow-capped peaks above the hollow. Her arm did not hurt anymore. Her ribs were knit. Her face was not the bruised face that had come up the mountain in December. When she came back inside, she went to the rifle rack. She lifted down the Winchester 73 that Jed had given her. She walked to the porch. She worked the lever, and the action sang. Nate came out behind her. He stood with her at the porch rail. He did not put his arm around her. They did not touch. They watched the long evening light on Cathedral Peak. 18th of May, she said. 18th of May, he said. He is mine, Nate. When the time comes, he is mine. He is yours. She nodded once. She lowered the rifle. She went back inside to help Bridget finish supper. The sun set behind the western ridge. The smoke went up straight and gray from the cabin chimney. 11 men cleaned their rifles by lamplight. The Wind River Mountains stood up cold and white in the first stars. And 40 miles to the southeast, in a small hotel room in Cheyenne, Cyrus Blackwood unrolled a hand-drawn map across a table and pointed with a pale finger at the head of a hidden valley, while a man with a broken nose and a long Sharps rifle measured powder into 8 paper cartridges and said nothing at all. The 18th of May came up clear and cold over the Wind River Mountains. The night before, a hard frost had silvered the meadows of Callaway Hollow, and the creek had run a thin ice at the edges. By full sunrise, the air smelled of pine resin and gun oil and bacon grease from the fire in the cookhouse Jed had built 4 weeks before, where Hannah and Bridget had kept the 11 mountain men fed through the long preparation. The trap was laid by then. Every yard of it had been walked, marked, walked again, refined and walked once more. The narrow gorge at the head of the trace, the only road by which a wagon and a Hotchkiss cannon could enter the valley, had been turned into a long killing ground. Jed had begun 3 weeks earlier with the powder. Joshua Drum had hauled 40 pounds of black powder up the trace from his forge, and Bo Larkin had brought 5 sticks of dynamite from a mining supply in Lander, and the brothers had laid charges in 9 different places along the gorge, in cracks of granite, and at the bases of certain leaning pines. Each charge had a slow match running back to a covered firing point on the rim where Wendell Hightower would crouch with 3 lit cigars and a clear line of sight. Zeke and Reuben Pickett had spent 10 days laying the tripwires. They strung fine wire across the gorge floor at ankle height anchored to dead falls. They dug small pit traps and lined them with sharpened pine stakes, the way Pickett had been taught to do by an old French-Canadian trapper north of the Yellowstone. They cut 3 large pine trees most of the way through at calculated points along the upper slopes, leaving them held by a single thin column of wood. A strong shove in the right place would bring those trees down across the gorge in 3 different sequences, blocking retreat at the rear, blocking advance at the front, and finally, if needed, dropping the cannon wagon into a ravine on the eastern side. Old Whitaker, despite his age, had ridden 2 complete loops of the surrounding ridges scouting flanking routes. He had identified 2 narrow mule trails that an enemy might use to come around the gorge from above. Both trails had been mined with covered pits and lookout posts, and Otis Pemberton and Arlo Gantry had been assigned to those flanks. They were the 2 best long-range shots in the valley, besides Zeke himself. Inside the cabin and along the meadow approaches, Nate had laid a different kind of preparation. He had set up a clean room with a scrubbed pine table, a lamp, his medical bag, fresh bandages folded in tin boxes, 2 bottles of carbolic, 3 of whiskey, and a wood box of saw and probe and pliers. He had drilled Bridget and Hannah on the bandaging of bullet wounds, on the sterilizing of needles in lamp flame, on the binding of a sucking chest wound with a piece of waxed oilcloth. They had practiced on each other until their fingers worked the cloth without thought. By dawn on the 18th, every man and woman in Callaway Hollow knew his place. Jed went around in the first gray light, walking the line of position by position, speaking quietly to each man. He clasped Caleb Mossbrook's hand at the rim post. He gave Bo Larkin a nod at the lower switchback. He laid his hand briefly on Joshua Drum's shoulder, where the blacksmith waited beside the second charge with Eulalie Tremaine's name carved on the stock of his Whitworth rifle. He came last to Hannah and Bridget at the cabin. Hannah was wearing buckskin trousers and a man's wool shirt under a heavy coat, with her hair braided tight against her skull. The Winchester .73 was in her hands. The Hotchkiss revolving cannon, a smaller 2-pounder model that Bo Larkin had quietly purchased for the brothers from a French trader 2 winters earlier, and that they had hidden behind the smithy ever since, had been moved to a sandbagged emplacement at the upper end of the meadow. Hannah and Bridget had been trained to feed and crank that gun. Sean Fenimore, who had come up the back trail in late April with 3 trusted federal deputies, was waiting beside it, a marshal's badge pinned to the lining of his coat. Sean was a wiry, red-haired man with the same freckles as his sister Bridget. He had aged 5 years since he had heard about the bell ringing in the window of the gray house on Maple Street. He had argued long and hard with Jed about taking Cyrus alive. Jed had not budged. Cyrus must be tried in the open before the people he had ruined. Cyrus must be hanged in front of every man who had ever cashed a Blackwood note. Sean had agreed at last. They had a federal warrant. They would take Cyrus alive if it could be done. If it could not, the warrant would be carried out by the rifle in the field. Cassius Holloway, the youngest of the federal deputies who had come with Sean, was already up at the cannon emplacement helping Bridget with the last belt of brass cartridges. Cash Holloway was 24 years old, lean as a willow switch, with light brown hair and a slow Texas drawl. He had been watching Bridget all spring with a particular quiet attention that Bridget had pretended not to notice. They worked together now in silence, his hands quick on the breech, hers steady on the feed. Jed stopped beside Hannah. He looked at her a long moment. "You hold this position. The cannon is the heart of the field. If they break through the gorge with the Hotchkiss intact, you and Bridget keep that gun firing until you cannot. That is your duty. And Cyrus. If he reaches this meadow, he is yours. I do not break my word, cousin." She nodded once. He squeezed her shoulder. He went to take his own place at the head of the gorge. The sun was a hand's width above the eastern ridge when the sound came. The faint creak of wagon springs, the clop of many hooves on hard ground, the voices of men who did not yet know they were walking into a coffin. Cyrus Blackwood's column was making its slow way up the lower trace. There were 12 riders in the head of the column. Marcus Doyle rode at the front, a heavy revolver on each hip and a long Henry rifle across his saddle. Behind him came Cyrus, on a tall black horse, dressed in a long dark riding coat, his face yellow and gaunt from a winter's confinement and a fast spring journey. Behind Cyrus came 8 bounty riders, hard men out of Cheyenne and Denver, men who had killed for pay before. Two more men drove the wagon that carried the Hotchkiss revolving cannon, an ugly square gun on iron wheels with a feeding belt of brass cartridges and a hand crank that could spit 40 rounds a minute through 5 rotating barrels. Two outriders trailed at the rear with spare horses on lead lines. They came to the mouth of the gorge at perhaps 10 in the morning. The sun was full up. The granite walls glowed a pale gold. Doyle held up his hand. He did not like the look of the place. He sniffed the air the way an old wolf sniffs the wind. He turned in his saddle to speak to Cyrus. He did not finish the sentence. The first charge fired. Wendell Hightower on the rim touched the slow match with the stub of his cigar and then dropped flat against the granite. The pine to his right gave a long groan and then crashed down across the trace 50 yards behind the cannon wagon. A blast of black powder threw a cloud of stone and dirt up into the morning sun. The two outriders at the rear were buried under the falling tree before they could scream. The column milled. The horses screamed. Doyle shouted commands. Cyrus jerked his black horse around suddenly, understanding that he had ridden into the very thing he had spent a winter promising to inflict on the men above him. The second charge fired. The pine ahead of the column came down across the trace at the front. The road was sealed at both ends. The cannon wagon was trapped in a stone alley 120 yards long with 12 trapped riders milling between the trees. Then Zeke Calloway and Joshua Drum and Caleb Mossbrook opened up from the rim with 3 long-range rifles. The first shots from those 3 weapons killed 2 bounty riders before any man below had clearly understood where the bullets were coming from. The third shot from Joshua Drum's Whitworth, fired with the careful aim of a man saying his niece's name aloud, killed a man as he tried to crank the Hotchkiss cannon into action. Mac Doyle was a professional. He did not panic. He saw the firing positions on the rim. He sized up the trap in 3 seconds. He understood that he was already dead, but he understood it the way an old wolf understands the trap on his foot. He shouted to his men to dismount, take cover behind the cannon wagon, return fire. Most of them obeyed. 2 ran. Reuben Pickett dropped 1 runner with a pistol shot at 60 yards. Otis Pemberton took the other from a flanking ridge. Doyle made one mistake. He thought the worst danger was on the rim. He turned the second man on the cannon to elevate the Hotchkiss skyward, and the loader began to feed the first belt. The cannon was just starting to crank when Bo Larkin, who had crawled in close along a side gully Doyle had not seen, threw a homemade dynamite charge under the wagon. The blast tore the wagon to splinters. The Hotchkiss cannon, the one weapon that might have evened the field, came apart in pieces of iron and brass. Then it was rifles and pistols in close quarters in a stone alley. Doyle himself broke through the smoke and dust on foot, dragging Cyrus by the arm, both of them firing pistols toward the rim to keep heads down. They scrambled over the front deadfall and ran up the trace toward the upper meadow. They were 2 men running for their lives in the only direction that was open, and the only direction that was open was straight into Calloway Hollow. Behind them in the gorge, the bounty riders died. 6 of them in the first 3 minutes of close fighting. 2 more tried to surrender, hands above their heads. Sean Fenimore's federal deputy, a man named Dawes, came down from cover and took those 2 at gunpoint. The fight in the gorge was over before the smoke had fully cleared, but 2 men were running up the meadow. Nate had been stationed at the lower edge of the meadow with a Spencer carbine. He had been told to hold there in reserve. When Doyle and Cyrus broke past the rim covering fire, Nate stood up from his cover and called out for them to halt. Doyle did not halt. Doyle was a fast man. He was perhaps the fastest man Nate had ever seen. He turned and put 2 rounds from his Henry rifle into Nate's chest before Nate could fire a second shot. Nate went down in the spring grass. The Spencer fell across his legs. He did not move. From the cabin porch, Hannah saw it happen. She saw Nate stand. She saw the muzzle flash from Doyle's rifle. She saw the way Nate folded forward as though something inside him had given way all at once. A sound came out of her that was not a scream. It was older than a scream. It was the sound a Wyoming wolf makes when its mate is shot. She came down off the porch with the Winchester already at her shoulder. She walked, she did not run. Her boots pressed hard prints into the new spring grass. She did not feel the ground. She did not feel her arms. She felt only her own breath going out all the way Jed had taught her over the winter. Doyle saw her coming. He raised the Henry rifle for the 3rd shot. She fired first. The Winchester lever sang. The butt plate slammed her shoulder. She did not feel the slam. The first round caught Mac Doyle high in the right shoulder and spun him a quarter turn. The second round caught him low in the belly and folded him at the waist. The third round fired the moment the second round had left the barrel took him through the heart. He went down face forward on the grass and did not move again. Cyrus had stopped 20 feet behind Doyle when the first shot came. He saw Doyle fall. He saw the woman walking toward him with a Winchester rifle in her hands, and he saw who she was, and a strange small noise came out of his throat. He turned and ran toward the cabin door. Bridget was still at the cannon emplacement with Cash Holloway. The cannon was no longer needed. Bridget came running back toward the cabin to help with Nate. She reached the front porch 15 seconds before Cyrus did. She did not see him coming until she was already on the porch and heard the boot on the boards behind her and turned and saw him. Cyrus took her by the collar of her dress. He pressed the cold barrel of his nickel-plated Colt against the side of her temple. He stepped backward into the open doorway of the cabin, dragging her in with him. "Stand off, woman," he shouted. Hannah was already at the foot of the porch steps. He could see her over Bridget's shoulder. "Stand off, or this Irish bitch dies right now. You drop that rifle. You drop it on the boards or she dies. Now. Now." Hannah stopped. Her eyes did not leave him. "Drop the rifle," Cyrus repeated. His voice had gone high and thin. The careful banker was gone. The cold husband was gone. What remained was a man who had been beaten and chained in a root cellar all winter by people he had thought were beneath him, and had now lost every man he had hired, and could feel his entire long swindle of a life caving in around his shoulders like a mine roof. Hannah lowered the Winchester slowly. She set it carefully on the boards of the porch. She stepped back from it. "Now you come inside," Cyrus said. "Both of you. We are going to talk. We are going to come to terms. You and your maid and I are going to walk down this mountain together. I have money in Cheyenne. I have friends still. We can come to terms." Hannah climbed the porch steps. She walked into the parlor of the cabin. Cyrus moved deeper into the room, dragging Bridget with him, his back to the cold hearth where the fire had not yet been laid that morning. He kept the pistol pressed to Bridget's head. "Sit down, Hannah." "No." "Sit down." "No." He stared at her. The stare he had used for 13 months in the gray house on Maple Street. The stare that had broken her ribs and her spirit and her sleep. It did not break her now. She had been broken once. She had been put back together with Tennessee blood and Wyoming weather and the slow patience of 3 men who had taught her how to breathe a rifle's breath. The stare he was using on her now was an old stair. It belonged to a dead woman, the woman she had been in November of '78. That woman was not in the room. The door behind Cyrus moved. Cyrus did not see it move. Hannah did. She kept her eyes on his face. She did not let her gaze slide. Nate Calloway was crawling. He had not been killed. The 2 rounds from Doyle's rifle had caught him in the chest, but one had glanced off a rib and gone wide, and the second had punched through the meat of his upper chest and out his back without taking the heart or the great vessels. He had lain in the spring grass for half a minute with the breath knocked entirely out of him, watching the sky. Then he had remembered Cyrus, and he had begun to crawl. He had crawled across 100 yards of spring meadow on his elbows, leaving a long red trail in the new grass, and he had reached the back porch of the cabin, and he had pulled himself up to his knees, and he had dragged himself through the back door into the kitchen, and he had crawled across the kitchen floor to the parlor doorway with his Colt revolver in his good hand. He was now lying flat behind the parlor sofa, 10 feet behind Cyrus. He could see Hannah's face. He could see 1 inch of Cyrus's right shoulder past the edge of the sofa. Hannah saw him. She let no flicker of recognition cross her face. She kept her eyes on Cyrus. "You will not walk down this mountain, Cyrus," she said. "I will. I have walked out of harder corners than this one. You have not. You will not shoot me with a maid against my chest. I will not." She took 1 slow step sideways. Cyrus tracked her with the Colt, turning his body slightly to follow her. The 1 inch of his right shoulder became 2 inches, then 3. Nate fired. The pistol shot was very loud in the parlor. The bullet took Cyrus through the right shoulder where his arm met his body. The Colt jerked sideways and went off into the floorboards. Bridget wrenched free and dropped flat. Cyrus staggered backward, his right arm hanging, useless blood already soaking through his coat. Hannah crossed the room in 2 strides. She did not pick up the Winchester. She picked up Cyrus's nickel-plated Colt off the floor where he had dropped it. She turned to face him. He had fallen against the cold hearth. He sat there now with his back against the stones, his right arm at his side, his face white. Bridget had crawled across the room to Nate. She was already pressing her apron against the wound in his chest, weeping and steady at the same time. Hannah stood over Cyrus. She thumbed back the hammer of his own Colt. The click was small and clean. "Cyrus Blackwood," she said, "for Marjorie Sutcliffe of Boston, for Cordelia Brennan of Pittsburgh, for Philomena Vanderstein of St. Louis, for Eulalie Tremaine of Atlanta, for Tobias and Mary Beth Calloway, for Reverend Ezra Whitmore, for the child you killed in me last spring before I knew it was there." Cyrus's mouth moved. No sound came out. "For the girl I was in November of '78 when I stepped down off a train in this country. For my father, Josiah Bellwether, who would weep at what you did to his only daughter. For my mother, Sarah, who was your sister-in-law, by blood, you never knew you had married into." His eyes widened. "Yes," she said softly. "I am Sarah Calloway's daughter. The men outside who came down a mountain through a blizzard for me are my blood cousins. The man bleeding behind that sofa is the man I am going to marry if he lives, which he will. You did not only put your hand on a Charleston preacher's orphan, you put your hand on a Calloway. You ought to have asked who my mother was before you sent for me through the matrimonial times. You ought to have asked." She lowered the pistol. She did not fire. "The Lord said, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay.' He has lent me his hand more than once. He will not lend it for this. You do not die here on the floor of my cousin's cabin. You go to Cheyenne. You stand before a federal judge. You hang in the open air in front of every man in Wyoming who took your money for 13 years. That is the killing you have earned. That is the killing the Lord will allow." She uncocked the pistol carefully and held it loose at her side. "Sean Fenimore is on his way up here right now with 3 deputies. You will be in irons in 5 minutes. You will never touch another woman again. You will not see a sunrise that is not a prison sunrise from this morning until the morning they put the rope on you. And then you will see one last sunrise in Cheyenne in front of a crowd. And then the Lord will deal with you in his own court." Cyrus stared at her with an expression she did not recognize on his face. It was the first true fear she had ever seen in him. He had spent 13 months teaching her fear and had never learned what fear looked like himself until now. He closed his eyes. Sean Fenimore came in 2 minutes later with Cash Holloway and Dawes behind him. They put Cyrus in iron wrist shackles. They tied a rough field bandage on his shoulder so that he would not bleed to death before they got him down to Cheyenne. They marched him out of the cabin and down to the meadow and chained him to a wagon wheel under the watch of 2 armed deputies. He sat there the rest of that long day, head down, and said nothing to any man. Inside the cabin, Nate fought for his life on the scrubbed pine table. Bridget held the lantern. Hannah threaded the curved needles. Jed, who had come in from the gorge with a rifle bullet through his left calf, sat at the head of the table and held his brother's good hand while Zeke worked the probe down into the wound. The bullet had not taken the heart. It had not taken the lung in any final way. It had passed through the upper chest and out the back, leaving a hole that would heal if infection could be fought. Zeke cleaned the wound with whiskey. He cauterized the worst bleeders with a heated knife blade. He packed the wound with clean linen and bound it tight. He prayed the whole time he worked. The prayer was a Callaway family prayer in the old Tennessee manner, half psalm and half plea. Nate breathed slow and shallow through the prayer. He did not lose consciousness. He looked at Hannah while she threaded the needles. He did not stop looking at her until the wound was closed. "Hannah," he said when Zeke set the last bandage, "I am here. Marry me." The room went quiet. Bridget put a hand to her mouth. "Yes," Hannah said. "Yes, when you are walking again. Yes." He smiled the small lopsided smile with the chip in his front tooth. He closed his eyes. He slept then for the first time in 2 days, breathing slow and even under the lamplight. The summer of 1880 was a summer of long roads and federal courtrooms. The men of Callaway Hollow rode down to Cheyenne the 2nd week of June with 8 prisoners, 3 wagons of evidence, and a sworn statement from Bridget Fenimore in a leather case across Sean's saddle. The trial began in the federal courthouse on the 22nd of June. Cyrus Blackwood was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder for the 4 brides and Reverend Whitmore. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for Tobias and Mary Beth Callaway. He was charged with conspiracy forgery of federal land documents, bribery of public officials, and a dozen smaller crimes. Sheriff Tobias Crow testified for 2 days. He named 17 men in Cheyenne and Washington who had taken Blackwood money. The federal prosecutor sent telegrams east, and the eastern arrests began within the week. Hannah May Bellwether. Blackwood took the stand on the 3rd day. She wore a simple gray dress and her mother's gold cross at her throat. She testified for 4 hours. She did not weep. She did not falter. She named every blow, every chain, every locked door, every threat. The courtroom was perfectly silent. The judge, a man named Adamson, listened with his hand against his mouth. When Hannah finished, the judge had to clear his throat twice before he could call the next witness. Bridget Fenimore testified the next morning. She brought her ledgers and her letters and her observed dates. The case against Cyrus was now a brick wall as high as a courthouse roof. The verdict came in on the 12th of August, guilty on all counts. Cyrus Blackwood was hanged in the public square of Cheyenne on the morning of the 25th of August, 1880. 200 men stood in the square to watch. Among them were 37 men who had once cashed Blackwood notes in the bank at Blackwood, Wyoming Territory. The hangman read the warrant. Cyrus did not speak. He looked up at the sky once, and then he looked at the crowd, and his mouth moved, but no man could hear what he said. The trap fell. He died at the rope. Hannah did not go to the hanging. She stayed at the boarding house where Mrs. Adelaide Whitlow, the dressmaker from Blackwood, was now mending shirts to feed her daughter. The two women drank tea together in a small parlor while the bells of Cheyenne rang the hour. Hannah did not speak of Cyrus. She spoke of Mrs. Whitlow's daughter Lavinia, who had grown into a tall, calm young woman with dark hair and a quiet smile. Lavinia had asked very shyly after the eldest Calloway brother, the one with the long scar. Hannah had not laughed. She had simply nodded and made a note of it. Sheriff Crow was sentenced to 25 years at hard labor in the territorial prison. He died of a fever in the 3rd year of his term. Reverend Ezra Whitmore was already dead, killed by Cyrus's own hand the previous winter. The estate of Cyrus Blackwood was seized by federal order. The 200 acres at the head of Blackwood Valley were returned to the surviving heirs of Tobias and Mary Beth Calloway, which is to say to 3 brothers and 1 cousin. Substantial sums were paid out to the surviving families of the 4 murdered brides. A trust fund was set up for Aunt Prudence Bellwether of Charleston, who lived comfortably for the remaining 7 years of her life on funds drawn from the man who had murdered her niece's marriage. The town of Blackwood was renamed New Sweetwater the following spring. The Maple Street house was burned to the ground at the request of the new town council. The bell that had hung in the upper window survived the fire. Hannah carried it home in her carpet bag. Hannah and Nathaniel Calloway were married in the small chapel Zeke had built in the hollow on the 7th of September, 1880. Nate was still thin from the wound, but he stood at the altar without help. Hannah wore a simple dress of soft white wool sewn by Mrs. Whitlow herself, with a small wreath of late mountain wildflowers in her honey blonde hair. Aunt Prudence had not been able to make the journey, but she had sent her own mother's wedding ring across the country in a small velvet box, and Nate slid that ring onto Hannah's finger while Zeke read the vows. Bridget Fenimore married Cassius Holloway the following spring in the same chapel. Cash had taken a discharge from the federal service and gone to work running cattle on a small piece of the recovered Calloway land. They built a cabin a mile down the creek. They had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and the eldest girl was named Eulalie. Jedediah Calloway married Lavinia Whitlow in the autumn of 1881. Lavinia had been writing to him since the trial. He had not known how to answer at first. Zeke had finally taken the unanswered letters down off the mantel and set them in front of Jed and said, "Brother, the Lord did not save you out of a war and a winter for you to sit alone the rest of your days." Jed had answered the next letter. Lavinia rode up the trace the following spring with her mother and a single trunk. They were married 3 months later. Mrs. Whitlow stayed at the hollow for the rest of her life and helped to raise 3 Calloway grandchildren. Ezekiel Calloway never married. He became the minister of a small log church that the mountain men of the region built together 2 miles down the trace from the hollow. The church served the scattered families of the Wind River High Country, the trappers and the homesteaders, and the small ranchers, those who could not easily come down to a town. Zeke read the Sunday services for 37 years. He buried old Whitaker in 1887. He baptized 17 children of the Hollow in his own creek. He kept a small leather Bible in his hip pocket every day of his life. Old Whitaker was 80 when he died. The brothers buried him on the bench above the cabin beside Tobias and Mary Beth. His grave marker was a simple river stone with the single word "friend" cut into it. The bell from Maple Street was hung above the front door of the Hollow cabin. It stayed there for the rest of Hannah's life. She rang it at supper every evening to call the family in from the meadow. She rang it at Christmas. She rang it on the first morning of every spring. She did not speak of why she had kept it. She did not need to. In the autumn of 1905, 25 years after the morning at the gorge, a young journalist from the Cheyenne Daily Tribune named James Ashby Crook climbed the trace up to Callaway Hollow. He had come because his editor had finally allowed him to chase a rumor he had been chasing for 2 years. The rumor of the Belle of Blackwood Hollow, the mail-order bride who had killed a Wyoming devil and married a mountain man and lived in the high country with her family. He found a place that did not look like a legend. It looked like a working ranch. There was a substantial cabin of squared logs, much enlarged from the original 3 rooms, with a long porch that faced the western ridge. There were 3 smaller cabins arranged in an arc across the meadow, where Bridget and Cash had built one, and Jed and Lavinia had built another, and a third belonged to a married daughter of the Hollow. There was a barn, a smithy, a chapel, a 1-room schoolhouse where the journalist would later learn Hannah Callaway had taught the children of the high country to read for 15 years. There were 3 corrals, 2 herds of cattle, a paddock of horses, a long cottonwood-lined creek, and a vegetable garden the size of a Charleston city block. A woman of perhaps 50 was sitting on the porch in a rocking chair paring apples into a wooden bowl. She had honey-blonde hair gone partly silver. Her figure was full and soft, the figure of a woman who had eaten well and laughed often for 2.5 decades. Her cornflower blue eyes lifted when she heard the journalist's horse on the trace. She smiled the smile of a woman who had not been afraid in a long time. A tall man came out of the smithy across the meadow, wiping his hands on a leather apron. His hair was brown-gray. He had a slight stiffness in his stride from an old wound in his upper chest. He saw the journalist arrive, and he set down the apron, and he came across the meadow with the slow, easy step of a man who is going home. "Mr. Crook, is it?" the woman said from the porch. "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Callaway." "Step down. Coffee on the stove. You have ridden a long way." He stepped down. The man from the smithy had reached the porch by then. He held out a hand. "Nathaniel Callaway. Pleasure to meet you, sir." "Pleasure to meet you. I will not take long. I only meant to ask Mrs. Callaway a question or 2 for the Sunday paper." "Ask all you like. We have all afternoon." The journalist sat on the porch. He drank coffee from a tin cup. He watched the children playing in the meadow. There were 8 of them under 12, the 2 living grandchildren, and a half-dozen who belonged to the daughter and to Bridget and Cash down the creek. They were chasing a brown puppy through the long grass. Their voices rang up the slope like small bells. He asked his questions. Hannah answered them quietly. The journalist had expected to find a hard woman, a frontier killer with stories to thrill a Cheyenne reader. He found instead a pastor's daughter from Charleston who had grown into a rancher's wife and a schoolteacher. Her hands were soft on the apple knife. Her voice was low. Her eyes were kind. "Mrs. Calloway," he said at last, "after all you suffered in that house in Blackwood, after everything that happened, have you ever in 25 years regretted any of it? Coming west, marrying badly the first time, the night they came for you, the morning at the gorge. Have you ever once looked back and wished it had gone differently?" She set down the knife. She looked out across the meadow toward the far western ridge. The sun was just beginning to drop toward the peaks. The light went gold on the late summer grass. "Mr. Crook," she said, "I came west as a mail-order bride to keep my aunt out of the poor house. I expected to die in that house on Maple Street. By the second month I was certain I would die there. I was the 5th woman that man had married, and the 5th woman he meant to bury. The Lord did not spare me by a quiet miracle. The Lord spared me the slow way, the human way. He sent a fur trader on a train. He sent an Irish maid up the back stairs. He sent 3 cousins down a mountain through a blizzard. He sent 11 mountain men across the Wind River high country to a gorge in the spring. None of those men knew when they were born that they would come to a place called Calloway Hollow on the 18th of May, 1880, and stand between me and the man who had bought me from a newspaper. The Lord knew. The Lord knew before any of us were born." She looked at her husband. He was sitting on the porch rail beside her. He had reached over and taken her free hand in his own, work-hardened one. He smiled the small, lopsided smile with the chip in his front tooth. The smile she had loved since the first night she saw it through a fever in his cabin. "I was a Charleston preacher's daughter," she said. "I was a soft, round girl who had never set a fire or shot a rifle or buried a friend. I came up this mountain in a blizzard in a man's bearskin coat, half dead with a broken arm, and a face I could not look at in a glass. 25 years later, I sit on this porch with my husband and my children's children. I taught school for 15 years in a building these men built with their own hands. I buried my Aunt Prudence in Charleston the year my eldest was born. I buried old Whitaker on the bench above this cabin with 2 of my cousins beside me. I rang that bell over the door this very morning to call my husband in for breakfast. She nodded once at the small brass bell hanging above the cabin door, dark with the patina of 25 years of mountain weather. They thought a woman like me had no place in the West, a woman too soft, too round, too quiet, too churchly. They thought women like me were prey. They were wrong. The West was made for women like me. The West was made for any woman who has ever been told to sit down and be quiet and finally decided to stand up instead. I do not regret 1 mile of the road that brought me here. I do not regret 1 bruise. I do not regret 1 prayer. I do not regret 1 shot fired on the morning at the gorge. The Lord brought me home, Mr. Crook. He brought me home through a long door, but he brought me home. The journalist sat very quietly for a long time. He put away his pencil at last. He had not written a single word in 5 minutes. He understood that no notes were needed. The story was already written into the porch boards and the meadow grass and the small brass bell above the door. He stayed for supper. Hannah rang the bell as the sun touched the western ridge. The children came in from the meadow. Bridget and Cash walked up from their own cabin down the creek, gray-haired, now smiling in the easy way of long married people. Jed and Lavinia came over from their cabin, Jed leaning slightly on a hawthorn cane he had cut himself the previous spring. Zeke came up the trace from the chapel, his Bible in his pocket, a little bent in the back from 37 winters of mountain weather, but his amber eyes still keen. They sat down to a long table. There were 19 at supper that night, 3 generations of Calloways and Fenimore Holloways and Whitlows and 1 bewildered young journalist from Cheyenne. Zeke read the blessing. Nate carved the roast. Bridget passed the biscuits. Hannah, at the foot of the table, looked down its long length at her family, and she smiled. In the spring of 1906, James Ashby Crook published his article in the Cheyenne Daily Tribune. The headline read, "The Belle of Blackwood Hollow, a Wyoming legend of love, faith, and quiet justice." The article ran 2 full pages. It was reprinted in 17 newspapers across the West before the summer was out. It was reprinted in the Charleston News and Courier in October. A copy of the Charleston paper found its way by some long road to a small leather album kept by Hannah Calloway in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She placed it carefully in the album between a tintype of her father and a pressed wildflower from her own wedding day. She closed the album. She set it back in the cedar chest. Above the door of the cabin, the small brass bell hung quiet in the soft spring air. It had rung once on a December night in 1879 in a window in a town that no longer existed while a blizzard howled and a woman waited to die. It had rung 25 years of suppers and Christmas mornings and first days of spring since, and it would go on ringing for as long as a Calloway lived in that valley to ring it. The Lord works slow, but the Lord works, and he had worked here.